Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to your American history class. I hope you're staying safe, washing your hands, not going crazy, yada, 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 all that kind of stuff. Um, quick announcements. Quiz on Thursday. I will post that and give you a few days to be able to take that quiz. We're also having our first Zoom meeting. We're all actually going to be together on Thursday at 3 p.m. So be sure you're there for that. That is the class for that day. I won't post a lecture that day, but if you just show up, log in, we're going to talk about the book, and you'll get your you get 25 points for pop quiz just for showing up to that one. So today's lecture is going to go a little bit longer because this is going to kind of include that material that would be on Thursday, since we're only going to be talking for about 45 minutes or so. This one's just going to run a little bit longer. There's just kind of a bunch of stuff to cover in this, but I like this lecture. There's a lot of interesting material in here. So we're getting into the 19th century, which I like better. I'm a more comfortable footing in the 19th century with American history. I like the 18th century stuff, but it's just never the area I studied very much. But I have spent more time studying all this stuff, especially concerning slavery and stuff like that. So I don't know. I at least will be getting more out of from now to the end of class, and hopefully you will too a little bit. Not that you weren't learning so much before. So anyway, there's a couple slides I brought over. I ended the last one a little bit early. There's a couple slides I didn't cover. I just cut and paste that over to this. And that'll be posted with this lecture as well. I got click on there. Learning goals. There's one slide I didn't cover going all the way back to the Bill of Rights 2 lectures ago, I realized. And this fits in with today's stuff, actually. But in the whole process of ratifying the Constitution, making lots of deals and things like that, they were able to reach compromises. Despite having these two very opposing viewpoints for the future of the country. And basically, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison struck this pretty important deal that was going to have long-lasting repercussions. Hamilton really wanted this national bank to stabilize the economy. The Southerners in the Democratic Republicans really didn't want the national bank. They thought it was, this is government overreach type of thing. So they made a compromise, because at this point, the capital of the country is still in Philadelphia. That's where the First Continental Congress had met. It had been the biggest city in the Union for a long time. So Southerners were upset that it's a northern, it's not super far north, but it is, it's in a northern state. And the deal that Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison met was, they had this sort of private dinner where, they drank and talked and just sort of work things out amicably, where we are going to allow there to be a national bank, and in exchange, we are going to move the capital of the country to a new city. We're going to make a brand new city close to the border. It's going to be in the South, but it'll be still not deep South, close to the Mason-Dixon line that separated the slavery, no slavery line. And all they agreed to in that moment that they were going to make this new city somewhere in there. That new city, of course, is eventually Washington, D.C. And George Washington, the president, helped survey it himself. Part of the reason he chooses it is because it's close to his estate, as president. He's able to oversee this new capital being made and, and survey it, with like a day's ride from Mount Vernon where he lived. So that the National Bank will be gone in 30 years from this time, but obviously Washington, D.C., still there today. And it's a city that was nothing. It was a swamp, basically, and they completely built it up from the ground up, largely on slave labor. So there you go. So I forgot to mention that a while ago. Jumping forward 10 years, I left off last time talking about the election of 1800. And in this election, let's realize that I want a couple more notes right here. in this election, they had, you know, it'd been really dirty politics. You know, we have, you know, the president of the United States, John Adams, being called a hermaphrodite. You know, you have the leading candidate, Thomas Jefferson, who was vice president, being, you know, they said he's, you know, son of a half-breed squaw, and, you know, at one point they said he was dead, stuff like that. So it was a really contentious election, but like I said, they did this with this view of having, you know, they have very different ideas of where the country is going to go, and so it's, you know, they feel like whoever wins this is winning the future of the country, basically. In a way, this is almost like the first election, because, you know, it had gone from, you know, Thomas, you know, or George Washington had been, you know, elected unanimously, then it had gotten passed to his vice president. You know, this was kind of the first major changes in administration. And it would be the first major change in administration because that's as Thomas Jefferson wins. Even though he was he had been part of the George Washington administration, you know, he had always had this, you know, different view of the country. And it was a big deal because, you know, everybody was worried that political power would not get passed. If the opposing side wins an election, you know, what if John Adams just refuses to leave office? He doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the election and refuses to leave. You know, that was something people were actually worried about, for good reason, happening. And Jefferson wins. He beats Adams pretty decently, thanks to the Electoral College and the 3/5 compromise. You know, even though there's less votes counted, you know, actual voters in the South, those southern states, those less populous states, their votes are weighted a little bit higher, you know, in favor of who they vote for. But what happened was Jefferson and the guy who was supposed to be his vice president, who ends up becoming his vice president, Aaron Burr, tied. At this time, you ran, whoever got first and second place would be president and vice president, and that would have been, this idea was, you know, the two most popular, capable people will end up becoming president and vice president. So that's what had happened the last time when John Adams had won. His, you know, number two is Thomas Jefferson, and in this, was the first time that there was like a ticket that the two nominees were running on the same, you know, running together, saying, hey, if you like Thomas Jefferson, also vote for Aaron Burr. And they ended up actually tying, since like they're, you know, their vote, people are running for the same office. And this had caused a lot of confusion. And previously, Aaron Burr had said, if there is a tie for any reason, but the unlikely event there's a tie, don't worry, I'll step down. Jefferson is clearly the more capable man, you know, he's the bigger deal. He's the guy that signed the Declaration of Independence. So Aaron Burr had said, don't worry, I'm going to be humble. But when the time came and the tie came up, he said, no, I think I should be president. And he backed off of that. And he tried to, the bid said, you know, that he deserves to be president just as much as Jefferson does. Not a good way to start out a new administration, the president and vice president fighting against each other like this. So the tie had to get broken in Congress, and there was more Federalists in Congress. So it's basically up to them to cast the vote. You know, the Democratic Republicans have been kind of divided on this. The Federalist votes, you know, who didn't like either one of these guys very much, had to break this tie. And that really meant all the Federalists would go along with whatever Alexander Hamilton had said, whatever, you know, he's the leader of the party, and whatever he says is the way they would go. So for a long time, the Federalists were trying to just kind of mess everything up and hope they had to just redo the whole election, and maybe John Adams or somebody else, one of the Federalists, would end up becoming president instead. They're hoping just, you know, for a redo of the whole thing. So they were trying to sabotage the whole process. But eventually they could see, you know, and obviously this is like, you know, both sides are clearly putting their own self-interest over the country. But eventually Hamilton decides he's going to support Jefferson. He decides, doing an election over will be too much trouble. And, Hamilton doesn't like Jefferson, but he hates Aaron Burr even more. So he puts his support behind Jefferson, and all the Federalists vote for Jefferson, and that puts Jefferson into the presidency. So we can see here, early on, pretty much, every election since George Washington had been kind of a mess. They're going to have to rewrite the election laws after this. They can't have this uncertainty for every election. But I have on here, you'll see at the bottom here about James Callender. We're going to see what happens to him. If you remember, James Callender at this point is still sitting in jail for writing bad things about John Adams. And now that Jefferson becomes president, James Callender is going to be like, hey, maybe you should let me out of jail. I helped you out. I'm here because I was writing things on your behalf. And Thomas Jefferson is going to be like, who are you? No, you're beneath me. You're the dirty, scummy journalist that nobody likes. Like, I don't deal with the likes of you. So James Callender is going to be sitting in jail while all this is going on, burning up. He's really going to get more and more pissed off about this whole thing. And that will be important later on. But before we get to that, some significance of this election. These are some things that I was mentioning already here. So after this crisis of this tie between Jefferson and Burr, they decided we need to change how we do elections. We can't have the two, the number one and number two in the election become president and vice president. We need to separate it, and they're just going to run as separate offices. And the way we do it now, they're just on the same ticket together. For a while, they had it even like you would vote for president and then for vice president. But now, we're going to do it this way. So that's going to push for the 12th Amendment, change the election laws. Not super important to American history, really, but it is a significant thing that happened because of the election of 1800. More importantly, this was, like I said, the first real transfer of power. And many Europeans, have been watching this whole idea of this American experiment in democracy and saying, like, this is never going to work. There's no way a person who has this much power will give up that much power just because they're an election. This idea of will of the people is bullshit, and nobody's ever going to go along with that. So this was the first real test of that happening, of having someone's political rival, someone that has a completely different view of the country, to go along and say, go along with that. And they did. John Adams said, I lost the election. It's the will of the people. And Jefferson became president. And like I said, this is kind of an amazing thing. And we've done this, for 43 times since then. There's been a peaceful transfer of power, which was, like I said, completely unheard of in the world before this. People didn't leave office until they died, or there was a revolution, or maybe they would pass it on to some handpicked successor. But having a peaceful transfer of power where your political rival takes over, that just didn't happen. But it does after this. So this would really help solidify the future of American democracy. Finally, because of the 3/5 compromise and the Electoral College, because of the sort of outweighed power of the white Southern voter, that's how Jefferson won. Less votes were cast for him than John Adams, but because there's more people in the North, and they had made this deal, they had made this 3/5 compromise, and they made this Electoral College, this was the Constitution. But when it actually happens, a lot of Northerners were really annoyed about it. They're saying, yeah, we know we made this deal, but now it feels really undemocratic to have this kind of thing. And they're going to start complaining about what they call slave power. It's the power that these Southern slave-owning politicians, the power of slavery in the South, the power that they wield. They are the minority of people in this country, and in a lot of ways, doing the most morally abhorrent things. Yet they're going to wield a lot, like an outsized political voice, and Northerners are going to get more and more resentful about that. So this is really, one of the first things. We are pretty much from here on out, we are on the road to civil war, a slow progress towards the Civil War. This is kind of the first little hint towards that, this annoyance on the part of Northerners about the growing power of slave owners. So some stuff about, Thomas Jefferson becomes president, and let me jump over to this now. He, not only are we going to be talking about the whole idea of getting us to the Civil War, we're going to be talking a lot about slavery in general. Slavery is the cause of the war. I've only really touched on it here and there since the beginning of this class. And I've mentioned the last time I really talked about it, that Southerners knew that this was a bad thing. They knew it was wrong. They just didn't know how to get rid of it. Too much of their economy had relied on it. People had gotten too used to it over the past 100 years. They didn't know how to do it without totally collapsing the Southern economy. But they were talking about it. And Thomas Jefferson, a Southern, Virginia slave owner, plantation owner, one of the richest men in Virginia, one of the biggest slave owners, talked often about, how it was morally wrong to own slaves. And his sort of, he writes, the moral commerce between master and slave is the perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on one part and the most degrading submissions of the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. This quality is the gem of all education in him, and from the cradle to grave, he is learning to do what he sees others do. So, the thing, Jefferson's biggest complaint about slavery is not how horrible it is for the Black people who are enslaved. It's about how bad it is for the white people who own slaves. He did not have a ton of sympathy for people of African descent. He, thought they're lesser people. Jefferson is definitely a white supremacist. He thought they were lesser. He thought it's in their nature to be servile, or and in that, and in lots of ways, he would think that they are helping Black people become civilized. His complaint is the idea of owning slaves is, it drags down white people, having to do it. To be an effective slave owner, you have to be cruel. And when your children see you be cruel to your slaves, they will imitate that. They're going to learn, and they will then be more cruel to their slaves. And this is actually true. This is something that happens. Why slavery becomes such a huge problem is because every generation is going to end up feeling more and more comfortable with this casual cruelty and become more and more brutal, and the whole thing will become more and more entrenched. They're going to feel more entitled to owning slaves. When it was new, they're like, this is the new thing, we're not sure about it. But a few generations down the line, they're like, it is my God-given right. This is the way we've always done things. They feel like much more, like I said, entitled to being slave owners. So that's what Jefferson is complaining about. But he will, often says things about how, he wants to free his slaves, but can't. He always promises that he's going to do it when he gets out of debt. He never actually gets out of debt. But he writes, in a number of letters that he's planning to do it one day. But of course, he never actually does get around to it. He does start to think about how slavery, how will we end it one day? And the big problem that he sees is, what do we do with the former slaves? And this is, again, for all of Jefferson's horrible white supremacy, this is a question that is going to be, plague Abraham Lincoln, 60 years later. What do we do, even with the best of intentions of wanting to free slaves? What do we do with these people? Abraham Lincoln's view of it will be, we've treated these people so badly. We're never going to be able to get along. And, and white people are always going to feel that they're superior. Black people are always going to feel angry about the way they were treated, which kind of what happens. Jefferson's view of it was white people and black people can't live in this country together because black people will always be jealous of white superiority. The white people are so clearly better, the black people they're automatically going to be jealous of them. So that's his view of it. He had talked about deporting slaves, getting them, trying to, free them, and then pay off the slave owners, and maybe we'll even send kids. There's this whole thing about child separation, which they settled, was a totally different child separation than we see in the Trump administration. But this idea of new slaves that are born, we'll send them to Liberia, we'll send them to some African colony, and it'll be difficult for those kids and those parents, but somebody else will raise the kids over there, and how bad of a thing can it really be to separate parents and children? And that's kind of going to be his view of it. And he also thinks that we can't have white and black people living together because interracial mixing, no matter what, if black and white people live together on the same continent and both of them are free, then inevitably they will, they're going to have sex, they're going to have kids, and he sees this as the destruction of the white race. And he speaks often about how morally wrong it is for for white and black people to that sleep together and have children together and things like that. So at this point, you might be saying like, wait a minute, there's something I know about Thomas Jefferson, and it seems a little bit crazy that he's talking about how bad it is to have children with black slaves. Yeah, the thing that most people know these days about Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, Declaration of Independence, Louisiana Purchase. Oh yeah, and Sally Hemings, his slave that he carried on a decades-long relationship with and had a whole bunch of children with, and he became the father and also the slave owner of all of her children. So what the fuck is that about? Which is something that Jefferson never actually addresses. But so it was definitely talked about in this era. I mean, remember when I talked about James Callender sitting in jail, burning up, super angry about Jefferson ignoring him? Well, James Callender gets out of prison and is out of work. He writes a letter to Jefferson saying, hey, you owe me, I served my time in prison, but you have to pay my $200 fine, and you should give me a job in Richmond. He wants to work for the post office in Richmond. And Jefferson just ignores him, just totally blows him off. Callender writes another letter being like, hey, you owe me these things, and I know stuff about you. You can't just ignore me like this. I wrote bad things about presidents before. I'll do it about you. And Jefferson's like, no. This is beneath me. I don't address things like this. I don't want anything to do with James Callender. And people around Jefferson are being like, dude, you can't do this. He's gonna talk. He's gonna say things. And Jefferson's, I have nothing to be embarrassed about. That's ridiculous. Well, eventually, after enough time, James Callender writes articles about how Thomas Jefferson has had this long-term relationship with one of his slaves, a young woman named Sally Hemings. And this is one of the first big, presidential sex scandals. The Hamilton thing is sort of nothing compared to this. And this blows up. Talking about, Jefferson's supporters are going to be like, no, that's not true. He would never do that. But everybody is questioning. So let's take a look at who Sally Hemings is. We do not know a lot about her. For one thing, I could say that right off the bat, that's not her in this picture. We don't have a picture of her. She was a slave. People did not draw portraits of slaves, even ones that worked for presidents. So we don't really know much of what she looked like. We know she was beautiful. An artist drew this or painted this a few decades ago based off what small descriptions we have of her. And this is kind of the image that goes into our head for it. But it was definitely not a portrait at the time. So who was Hemings? She was born in 1773. She herself was the daughter of a white slave master and a biracial slave mother. So just like Jefferson will become the father slash master of her kids, she is also the product of a union like that. So his white slave master and her mother was also biracial. Sally Hemings and her 5 siblings were all only 1/4 African blood and 3/4 European blood. So they had very light skin, European features, things like that. While she was still an infant, her father slash master died, and the Jefferson family inherited Sally's family along with about 130 other slaves. When you're a rich slave owner, things like that does happen, I guess. And probably because they had lighter skin, the Hemings had a more privileged status in the Jefferson's house. They were never field slaves. They were always house slaves for sure. They're doing domestic work, inside Monticello. That's Jefferson's estate, is Monticello. And inside the mansion at his, when I say estate, I really mean plantation. So the Hemings always had, this always special position. Jefferson's wife died in 1782. And this is just after the American Revolution, after the War for Independence ends. And he's so grief-stricken, he promises never to marry again, which he never does actually marry again. About a year after that, he becomes the envoy to France and brings his whole family with him to live in France. And he basically becomes like, a French ambassador. And he brings with him young Sally, who will be like a nursemaid, really just a friend for his daughter, who is about the same age. And not nursemaid's not the right word. I'll come across it later. But she's basically, paid friend, of Jefferson's daughter. And she brings also James, Sally Hemings' brother, who Jefferson wants to train to be a French cook. He wants, specific French meals at Monticello. Jefferson loves all things French, and he wants to be able to have French cooking whenever he wants. So he wants to send James Hemings to the finest French schools, so so he could cook this at home. And this is where people see Sally for the first time, where out in the world, there's going to be other politicians and stuff who are going to see her. She learns to speak French, to read and speak French. She's, by all accounts, incredibly smart, very charming, very beautiful. Everybody who writes about her talk about how she's just strikingly beautiful. And she's clever. Everybody loves this girl. According to James, but before we get to that, then they're still there throughout the 1780s. And the French Revolution breaks out in 1789. At this time, technically, slavery becomes illegal in France. So technically, at that moment, Sally and James are both free. They do not have to go anywhere with Thomas Jefferson. They can take off and be free in France. But Sally, who was 16 years old at the time, was pregnant with Jefferson's child. And she agreed to return. Supposedly, he made a deal that he would free the children, any children he had with her at 21 years old. So just for the record, she's 16. He's 46 at that time, which really always skeezes people out. And she agrees to go back. James as well. They agree to go back to Monticello, to Virginia, where they will live out the rest of their lives in slavery. A privileged status, but still enslaved. The child that she was first pregnant with dies shortly after they returned to Virginia, but she'd go on to have 6 other children with the president. Sally's duties at Monticello include being, nursemaid, companion, lady's maid, chambermaid, seamstress, things like that. In the 1820s, when 2 of their daughters were in their 20s, they had fled Monticello separately enslaved's probably the wrong word. Technically, they were escaped slaves, but they were not pursued. An overseer said he had even been given, he gave money to give one of the girls, kind of this under the table deal that like he saw her off, basically, like letting them go unofficially. He doesn't want to officially free them. But I think if these kids are, they are now only 1/8 African blood, they will be able to pass as white out in the world. They don't really have to worry about being chased down by slave catchers, but they're not being pursued. And it was sort of a running joke amongst people that had visited Monticello about how there's slaves walking around with very light skin that look a lot like Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson never addressed what actually happened. He died in 1826 without ever officially freeing Hemings or any of their children. He would never talk about what actually happened. He always said it was beneath him to address such allegations. And there's always speculation through most of American history. People are like, was this just an attack on him? Maybe this is just a dirty rumor. But in the late 1990s, DNA testing had progressed enough, and they took a test with Jefferson's descendants and the Hemings descendants, and there was a match. There was enough that they could even look back at this common ancestor right around the year 1800, that they had all shared. So yes, it is good proof now that that he did have this relationship and did have all these children. There's always been a lot of speculation about the nature of their relationship. Was it a loving relationship? Was it malicious rape every time? It's probably somewhere in the middle. We just don't have enough information to know. I mean, but considering that not only how much younger Sally Hemings was, she was enslaved to him, it's really like any sense of consent that we would have today, we would say this woman could not confer consent. But the actual nature of the relationship is usually thought to be more tender than it was brutal, but I don't know. It is what it is. So speaking of slavery, at this time when Jefferson becomes president, it's also when it's going to be when a key moment about slavery it becomes available. I talked about this. There had been this when the Constitution gets signed. They put this stipulation in there that we can't touch slavery for 20 years. And then the film was originally written in 1787. They said we can't touch slavery until 1807. And then we can pass laws that have to do with it. So Jefferson becomes president in 1801. That is, if he wins re-election, and he does, that's going to be, while he's president. And there had been sort of this growing movement to, when this happens, we need to outlaw slavery completely. The Congress had passed this Fugitive Slave Act in 1793, establishing, trying to get to this problem of escaped slaves going to the North, and tries to lay out some rules about, who's on the hook for bringing people back, and the laws for that. By and large, Northerners are going to ignore this stuff. They don't want anything to do with helping capture slaves. Southerners are constantly going to be annoyed that Northerners aren't doing enough to protect their property. So that's going to be a going concern going forward. But there had been this growing debate over what to do about slavery. And that debate gets changed. It gets altered this time by a few different factors. One of those is the Haitian Revolution, which, Haiti, I've mentioned it before, early in this class. It's a small island. It's really half of an island, it shares with the Dominican Republic. Haiti was the French side of the island. Dominican Republic is the Spanish side of the island. But the French side, it had been Saint-Domingue. It had been this French colony, this massive sugar-producing colony that was, as I've said, was one of the most brutal places in the world, to be a slave, to be a human being. The life expectancy there was only about 3 to 5 years. From the time you arrive on the island, you will most likely be dead in 3 to 5 years. You will be worked to death, and hot Caribbean conditions. It's very difficult work. Cutting sugarcane, things like that. And when the French Revolution breaks out, there's a lot of things that happen because of the French Revolution, and we're really kind of dancing around that stuff. But Saint-Domingue is a French colony. French Revolution happens in 1789, and they have more important things going on in France than what's going on in this colony. A lot of the revolutionaries really did not want anything to do with the horrible slavery over here, but also it was a cash cow for their empire, so some wanted to maintain it. But anyway, in the French Revolution, with all these sort of counter-revolutions and wars that they're fighting, they lose their grip on their island of Saint-Domingue. They can't commit the resources when a slave rebellion rises up and slaves start killing their masters. And this would be a great story. I mean, nobody looks good in this. There'll be the first wave of slaves that sort of wipe out their masters, then try to enslave all of the other slaves. They try to make all the other slaves go back to work. This is a horribly 10-year-long bloody war on this little island where they'll just destroy everything. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. Nobody looks good. But they do eventually finish the war and establish their own independent country. This will be the second republic in the Western Hemisphere after the United States, only the very second one. And it's the first and only successful slave rebellion in human history, which sounds kind of crazy, but when you think about any sort of slave rebellion you think of, you go back to Spartacus and the Roman Empire, they were always captured and killed. Rebellion was always put down. There would be plenty of slaves have escaped before. There might be small scales things where you have slaves killing their masters and then running away kind of thing. But when you actually have an entire colony, they fight back and win and stay independent, never else has that ever happened in human history. It would be, like I said, a much heartwarming story if it wasn't such a brutal one. So they finally win and set up their own government and say, we are this new nation called Haiti, while Jefferson is president. This happens in 1804, and he refuses to recognize them. He says, you are not your own country, you are still French Saint-Domingue, I do not accept it. And he puts an embargo on anybody who would trade with we're not trading with Haiti, and and they're going to try and put sanctions on anybody who would trade with Haiti. Why does Jefferson hate this so much? Well, because Jefferson is a Southern slave owner. This guy who had once been all about freedom, liberty, independence, cheering on the French Revolution, but when these slaves are doing the same thing against the same tyrannical French government, then he's just no, that is not okay. So it's a slave rebellion. He says we can't endorse that, and he's worried it would spread to the United States. It might inspire other slaves in the South, which it's only 100-something miles off the coast of Florida. What if they start spreading dissent in southern states? And to be fair, that does happen. Next time later on we'll talk about some other slave rebellions, but one of the first sort of big slave rebellions that kind of changes the tone of things is inspired by the Haitian Revolution, and that comes with in Virginia, a guy named Gabriel, seemed to be, he's a blacksmith, he's trained blacksmith. You know, to be like a real blacksmith and know how to do it working, you gotta be a pretty smart guy. He's literate. He learned, you know, had read news about what was going on in Haiti and said, we're gonna do a similar style revolution here. He gets together about 20 other slaves and they plot to, they're going to sneak into Richmond, which is it's nearby. They're outside of Richmond, which is the capital of Virginia. And they're going to sneak in and kill the governor, who is James Madison at the time. Later on, he becomes president, and just kill basically as many white slave owners as we can. You know, one morning, Richmond is going to wake up and all of the richest slave masters are going to be dead, is their plan. And at that time, they think, you know, this will inspire all of the other slaves in Virginia to rise up. You know, once the head's chopped off, we can rise up and fight back. And they have a plan. They have a day set to go. On the day it happens, there's a huge rainstorm. And you know, this time it's really difficult to travel in rain. You know, they're going to go through all of this mud. It's going to be the huge pain in the ass to get there. You know, we'll be tired. You know, everything's going to be confusing in the rain. You know, this is not for good weather for this sort of operation. So it was like, let's just hold off for a couple days until the rain subsides. Well, in that time, somebody in the rebellion loses their nerve and tells their master about this rebellion. There's always somebody who's willing to sell these things out to you know, to score some extra bonus points for them, you know, like kind of selfishly. But that slave master goes and tells James Madison what's going on. He sends out the militia and captures Gabriel and his men and hangs them. Madison and Jefferson and pretty much all the rich white people in Virginia were seriously spooked by this. They were like, whoa, that was close. You know, like one person whispered, you know, in the right ear, and we found out about it. Otherwise, we could have all been dead. And, you know, as a reminder, they all know in the back of their head that these people could kill us. They know where we sleep and they could kill us at any time when we can't watch them perfectly 24/7, 365. Like, they really got freaked out about this. And they're going to pass a whole bunch of laws restricting slave movements. And this is kind of one of those moments where as we see slavery is kind of progressively getting worse, they're going to take away a lot of slave freedom and really black freedom in Virginia. Because at the time, 1/5 of the black population in Richmond was free, but they passed a bunch of laws saying that basically, you know, slave owners, it makes it very difficult for slave owners to free their slaves. You know, they put a bunch of loopholes in there or a bunch of, you know, stipulations that just says you can only free your slave if these certain conditions. If you are freed as a slave, then you have to leave Virginia, or else you could be put back into slavery. They're also going to make it more difficult to, basically all slaves have to be, can't congregate without white supervision. You like you can't have more than like 3 you know, slaves in any given place at a time without a white person there to watch. And a lot of times, even like in church and things like that, there had to be a white person like in the back of the church watching, you know, what was going on, because anytime you get too many people together, they might be plotting some sort of conspiracy. So they're going to put you know, all sorts of restrictions on you know, not just, like I said, not just people that are in slavery, but the free black people there as well. And it's around this time that you really start, Jefferson seems to harden and become more of a defender, you know, with this and with Haiti. He really starts to change his sort of tone from where he was about slavery. He will still endorse this act for prohibiting the importation of slaves. So a few minutes ago, when I was talking about the, you know, when the 1807 stipulation expires in the Constitution and they're allowed to pass a law that has to do with slavery, they had to do something. There was, you know, so much public pressure to be able to do something. They're not going to outlaw slavery, but Jefferson encourages Congress to pass this act for act for bringing no more new slaves in the country. And that's really all this is. This doesn't ban the slave trade just bans the importation of new slaves. So at this point, any slaves coming from Africa or into the United States is illegal. The transatlantic slave trade we had talked about in the beginning of the class, this sort of triangle of power, of slaves being brought around. That is, America is cutting themselves off from that. Slaves in the United States that are already here and their children, that's still legal. They can still be bought and sold here. No slaves could just now be brought in. And Jefferson says that, this is the first step on us outlawing slavery. We're one step closer to doing that. And he thinks that, or he says, we're going to, help this more naturally and gradually die out. But what actually happens is slavery ends up becoming worse because of this, because the slaves that are now here just got a lot more valuable. They are now, when you think that, you can't, if your slave dies, or if you free a slave, whatever happens, you can't just bring in new ones at any given time. Now, they could only grow, the slave population can only grow as fast as children can be produced. So that raises the value on slaves. And amazingly, people are going to be much less likely to free their slaves. And it's going to mean slave owners are going to want to put a tighter control on their slaves. They're going to be that much more scared about them escaping. And they're going to do that, put fear into them. This is a step that's, the actual day-to-day life of a slave becomes more cruel because slave owners are scared. We don't want these people running away. We'll let them, if we catch a slave running away, we're going to make an example out of them and torture them in front of everybody else. That type of thing becomes much more common after this. I feel like there's another point that I have about this, but you definitely see more and more, the idea of it being like, this is the natural order of things. This is our God-given right to own slaves. The kind of thing too, is once people become, when something gets sort of attacked, they're worried about something being taken away, people become more and more defensive about it. We see this happening with things now. Slavery had been, this part of the system, but once now people are talking about taking it away, an actual step had been made towards possibly, making making slavery more difficult. The slave owners are going to be that much more adamant about, this is our God-given right to do this, because now we're afraid it's going to get taken away. So you're going to see more of that going forward. So moving away from slavery, whatever your opinion of Thomas Jefferson, he is one of the most important presidents in American history for the sheer fact that he doubled the size of the country in a single day. That's pretty significant. And he does that with the Louisiana Purchase. And this also ties back to France and the Haitian Revolution and stuff like that. When the French failed to retake Haiti, Napoleon was now Emperor of France and decided, that's it, we're done with the Western Hemisphere. We have too much trouble. We're fighting wars on every front over here. We can't hold this. He's basically fighting a war against all of Europe, and he's kind of conquering most of Europe. And he doesn't want anything to do with the Western Hemisphere anymore, so he wants to sell off all of that land that they had in North America and make a good amount of money to help fund his war effort. Nobody was really living in that area anyway. There's a few French fur traders that are not really making much money off it. It's just sitting there. And really, the Indians living there, they have no idea they're living in French territory. They've never heard, most of them have never heard of a place called France, anything like that. But European and Anglo-Saxon record books, officially all of this area is part of France. So Napoleon's going to make the decision to sell the land to the United States, and he's going to do it at a pretty cheap deal. He's gonna sell cheap, and you would think this would be a slam dunk for Thomas Jefferson, that he would like, of course, I want to double the country for $15 million. I get to buy, like, the entire Midwest. That sounds great. But he's actually really torn on this issue, because all his ideological beliefs about governance are kind of getting pushed out the window with that. He's all about small government. He thinks that government should be limited, and the federal government can't do anything unless the Constitution explicitly states it. That's firm in his belief. That's what he's always said. If the Constitution doesn't say it, federal government can't do it. And the Constitution doesn't say anything about buying land from foreign rulers and adding it to the United States. That's just not that's mentioned anywhere in there. So if it was any other president, he would say, no, you can't do this, but it's good for the country. But he has to sell out his ideology, and he's worried he's going to set a precedent. If he does this now, that expands the office of the presidency, and it will. This will mean after this, presidents are going to say, I have the power to do all these things because, look, Thomas Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase. But Jefferson ultimately decides to do it, not just because, all of the land from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River, from Mexico to Canada, it's this huge area. He doesn't care about any of that half as much as he does about New Orleans. The city of New Orleans and the port that it's on is at the mouth of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is super important. It's this huge waterway that goes across North America, and that is how you get things around at this time. This is before trains, this is before planes, this is before consistent roads. If you're moving large numbers of things around the country, you do it by going up and down rivers. And the Mississippi River is the superhighway of this time. And whoever controls New Orleans controls the mouth of that river. So that had been French territory. It had been Spanish, then it had been French. And after Jefferson buys it, that's how it becomes part of the United States. So it's this sort of tactical decision, not just because he wants the United States to have it. He wants to make sure nobody else has it. It's the back door to the United States. If France had owned it, kept it, and decided to attack the United States, they'd be able to send gunships up the Mississippi River and basically conquer the whole frontier of the United States at the time. So this tactical decision, he says, I have to buy it. I don't like the ideology of it, but I'm going to do it anyway. He pays $15 million for it, which is somewhere around like $260 million today. These things really do not translate easily, because that'd be a great deal, $260 million for the entire Midwest. But those things, you can't adjust for inflation. So this doubles the United States instantly. Jefferson is going to be, I talked about the Jeffersonian democracy and how he wanted, go, from sea to shining sea of all these small farms and everything. This is, part of the way on that vision. This is not how he envisioned it happening, but, it's like, well, now we can do this. Of course, that land, he envisioned every citizen in the United States will own their own little plot of land and grow whatever they want. The Midwest is not great for growing tomatoes and turnips and stuff like that. It's prairie land that's good for ranching and things like that. But he didn't know that at the time, and in fact, he didn't know what was there at all. Nobody had really explored this. Even the French had scant maps of the area. So they send out. He sends his friends, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to buddies of his, more or less, to explore this area, with the most important thing they're trying to find is a river route going to the Pacific Ocean. Something they know they want to get there one day. All of this area that they know is up in the middle of the country, up around, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Montana, all of that stuff. They're worried that stuff is sort of too isolated. He wants Lewis and Clark to go up there and find a river route that will be able to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and something that hopefully might connect, between the Mississippi River and, and this potential river that would connect sort of, the two great oceans that they could travel across. That river does not exist, we know now. The Colorado River does go down to the Pacific Ocean. It goes a long way through there, but you can't, it's too much rapids. It's not navigable for like, commerce. But, I'm not going to go into Lewis and Clark really, but they set out with about 50 people to explore this area. They don't find the river. They do meet a French fur trapper and his wife, Sacagawea, who's a Shoshone woman, who I think when they had picked her up, they're around somewhere around like Nebraska or so, but she was from Idaho area originally. There's Shoshone people over there, so she spoke a number of these languages. And if you ever get the chance to, read anything or watch stories about Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea, it is interesting stuff, and you really see like she does save their asses a lot. They would be dead 1,000 times over, not just from translating, but just knowing about how to live in this kind of world, what you can eat and things like that. She teaches them completely how to survive out in this kind of wilderness. Okay, so at this point I would ask if there's any questions or anything like that. We are now shifting gears once again to something else that happens during Thomas Jefferson's administration. And that's sort of big moments in American history, even if it's not, doesn't have any long-lasting effects, actually, but it's a good story. So, perhaps somebody should make a Broadway musical about it. The duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And if you've listened to the Hamilton soundtrack, you know that, maybe you got lucky and you were able to see the show. I still haven't. I don't have the coin to drop on something like that. But I'll wait until, eventually it's got to be a movie, right? So Hamilton and Burr were rivals going across decades. This was not a new rivalry they had when they shot at each other and, out in the woods of New Jersey. But you would also know, if you've listened to the soundtrack, that they were once friends. They had originally met as friends. When Hamilton arrived in New York as a young kid and was going to college, Burr was already well established. He's a lawyer, and he saw himself as taking young Hamilton under his wing. This eager young man who wants to learn the ways of New York. I'm going to teach you. And he thought himself as to be like Hamilton's mentor. And Hamilton liked him. He did want Burr's help. But within just a few years, Hamilton completely outgrows and outshines Burr. Through his writing, through his military career, in every possible way, he's just smarter. And he's just, people like him better. He's more effective politician in every way. And Hamilton gets a new mentor, George Washington, which is definitely a step up from Aaron Burr. After the war, Burr was very famous and influential. He's one of those people that today we just remember him as the guy who shot Alexander Hamilton. But he was, a founding father, and he was, a very popular guy. Just Hamilton, always a little bit more so. In the song, in the room where it happens, they write about. The song is about Aaron Burr sitting outside of that meeting between Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, where they decide they're going to move the capital to Washington, D.C. And Burr's sitting out there all fired up because, there's this closed door dinner going on that he is, he's not a part of. All the important things now are happening without him. And he realizes that. And that's about him sort of burning up with jealousy about that. And that's a real thing. That's, that song is about that. That was a real thing. And this sort of becomes to define their relationship more than anything else. This sort of, jealousy on Burr's part and sort of dismissiveness now on Hamilton's part. A few years later, in the election of 1800, Jefferson chooses Burr as his running mate, as I had said. Jefferson didn't really like Burr very much, but he wanted a Northerner to be his running mate. He didn't want two Southerners basically on this same ticket. So he picked Burr as, someone who could bring the Northern vote. And then, of course, that results in a tie, and Burr ends up stabbing Jefferson in the back, saying he said he'd step down, then he refuses to do it, and tries to take the presidency for himself. After that crisis gets resolved, it gets resolved because Hamilton puts his weight behind Jefferson and not Burr. So Burr, it's very obvious to him that he blames Hamilton for this. Burr thinks, I would have been president if not for Alexander Hamilton. And this, Hamilton goes around being like, I don't like Jefferson very much, but that Aaron Burr, that guy's the worst. He uses the words despicable a lot. He says he thinks Burr is a dangerous and corrupt idiot who knows nothing about policy. He only wants power and fame. That's the type of thing Hamilton had been saying, and that inevitably gets back to Aaron Burr. And that's, he believes, I would have been president if this guy wasn't trash talking me all the time. And I feel like at this time, all the founding fathers are really getting sick of each other. They've been working together for years, for decades now, and it seems like they all kind of hate each other. But Hamilton and Burr, that's particularly contentious. So anyway, considering the betrayal coming from Burr, Jefferson doesn't want anything to do with this guy. Burr becomes officially the vice president, but he's like, I don't want you in this administration. I don't even want you in Washington, D.C. I don't ever want to look at you again. You betrayed me. So even though he's technically vice president, Aaron Burr goes back up to New York and just starts practicing law. He just becomes a regular lawyer in Manhattan. And, again, technically vice president, but not doing anything that has to do with the federal government. Also in Manhattan practicing law is Alexander Hamilton, who had been Secretary of the Treasury. He's a little bit disgraced himself because of that sex scandal that we had talked about last time. And so these two stars of the revolution, slightly disgraced now, working as lawyers, only blocks from each other, and just Manhattan Island is not going to be big enough for the two of them. When Jefferson starts running for re-election in 1804, they know he's obviously going to ditch Aaron Burr. He doesn't want anything to do with this guy. So Burr sees himself as free to run for another office, and he wants to be governor of New York. And the current governor of New York, a guy named George Clinton, was stepping down, and Burr thinks he's a shoo-in for it. He's like, oh, I'm one of the founding fathers. I'm great. He's like, everybody loves me. There's no way that I won't become the governor of New York. Hamilton, of course, goes around telling everybody who will listen, uses the word despicable a lot. He says Aaron Burr is a dangerous and corrupt idiot who knows nothing about policy, and all he wants is fame and power. So same stuff he'd been saying before. And Burr gets his ass handed to them in this election. Burr loses by a lot, just a total humiliation, wide margin loss. And honestly, with that sort of loss, there's nothing Alexander Hamilton was saying really could have made that much of a difference. But again, Burr feels like, if Hamilton wasn't trash talking me, I would have been governor. First he stole the presidency. Now he stole the governorship from me. Burr has had enough of this guy, of fucking this asshole Hamilton. And I gotta be careful how much I'm cursing here. I get excited. So anyway, Burr had remembered, this Hamilton is this innocent college kid. He's not so special. Who does he think he is? He's too big for his britches. And they exchange some angry letters back and forth. And soon it gets decided that honor cannot be satisfied until we have a duel. And duels were a way of sort of regaining honor and public respect. Didn't necessarily have to end in somebody dying. Just going out there and showing that this was important to you enough to have a duel on this issue, and risk your life. That was often enough. And people just fire their guns in the air, shake hands, and they go walk away and say, bygones are bygones at this point. But that's probably not going to be the case between these two guys. Hamilton had gone around saying that, he has no intention of shooting the vice president of the United States. He's like, I don't want that kind of trouble. I'm just going to go out there to regain my honor. But while he's saying that, Aaron Burr is in his backyard doing target practice. So dueling was illegal in New York. Then obviously they're in New York, like they do what New Yorkers do when they want to cause trouble and go into New Jersey. Dueling was also illegal in New Jersey, but it was more rural. It's not in the middle of a city. So there was this popular dueling spot at the called Weehawken, just across the river from Manhattan, where people often went in duels. And actually, weirdly enough, at this same spot, only weeks before Hamilton is killed at this duel, in Weehawken, at the same exact spot, his son, Philip, his oldest son, was also killed in a duel. Hamilton's son had gotten into an argument with somebody during a play, and they took the same boat trip across the harbor at the same spot in Weehawken. They stood, even using the same guns that Hamilton and Burr will use, and Philip Hamilton was killed. This is one of those weird things. So both these guys, they take separate boats over to Weehawken. We have the sitting vice president of the United States. It's like Mike Pence's position. It's like Mike Pence and now I can't think of who a former Secretary of the Treasury is. Like Obama's Secretary of the Treasury. God, I used to know that guy's name. I can't remember. But that would be these two guys dueling it out. And it's even bigger than that because they're founding fathers, these two guys. But they meet here. They went through this regular ritual where they take out watches and coins, anything that could slow a potential bullet, a glasses case, anything like that. You have to take all that stuff out. They line up. This whole ritual behind it. Hamilton fouls first, and we don't know what Hamilton, if he was trying to kill him or not, but we know the bullet went over Burr's head. He might have been aiming on purpose over Burr's head. He might have just missed. But you only get one shot with these guns. So now Burr carefully lines up his shot. You got to imagine how scary this is for Alexander Hamilton. You just have to stand there while a dude fucking lines up and points a gun at you. And carefully taking his time. He takes a shot. The bullet rips through Hamilton's ribs, just above his third rib, and then ricochets off his ribs, tearing through his diaphragm and his liver, before finally stopping in his spine. He falls to the ground. His friend was a doctor, a guy named David Hozak was there. And Hamilton just had enough strength to say, this is a mortal wound, doctor. And then he loses consciousness. He'll be taken across the river to the doctor's house, to Hamilton's house, where he'll die a day later without ever regaining consciousness. Witnesses said that after Burr had shot Hamilton, he seemed almost regretful. He seemed like kind of shocked and kind of started stepping towards Hamilton, being like, oh, crap, what did I do? Instead of walking towards them, and then other people rushed him away. Like, you got to get out of here. You just killed Alexander Hamilton. And like I said, Hamilton was not very popular in recent years before this because of the sex scandal stuff. But after dying, all anybody remembered was the good stuff. Sure, he was kind of an abrasive jerk, but he's unquestionably a genius. He worked his entire life to preserve and protect the United States. He was the guy that, engineered the American financial system, what brought the United States out of debt. And he did this at great sort of sacrifice to himself, put his entire life to this thing. And that was the thing everybody remembered. He's a war hero. He's invaluable to Washington fighting the war. He helped make the case for the ratifying the Constitution. Constitution probably would not got passed without Alexander Hamilton. He founds the Treasury Department. The whole country was spiraling out of control, and it's Hamilton, that finally gets the country back on a firm footing. So that's the things people remember. All of New York comes out to his funeral. Rumors have been swirling that Aaron Burr was having parties and celebrating murdering Hamilton. In fact, Burr was holed up in his house by himself, depressed, terrified what was going to happen to him. Word reached him that he was wanted for murder in New York. And New Jersey, he actually killed him in New Jersey. So he's wanted for murder. So he flees, he leaves New York to South Carolina. And at the time, there was no sort of extradition law. You could go to another state like that, and you couldn't be arrested and sent back up. So, and he's still vice president of the United States. So he's cooling his heels in South Carolina for a while, but then he has to go actually do his like sort of first official vice presidential duty. And basically there's an impeachment trial in the Senate, and he has to reside over it and break a tie in the Senate. And like while he's doing that, in the Capitol, he's wanted by the police in New York and New Jersey. But he does that. His term ends a little bit later. Obviously, he is not brought on into Jefferson's second administration. And then this is where things get really weird too. If it's not weird enough, Burr had been buying up a bunch of land in Texas, and he leaves. Texas was not yet a state. It was part of the Spanish Empire. It was not even part of Mexico. Mexico was not a country yet, but the area that we call Texas now, he was buying up a bunch of land there, and had been raising his own personal army. And Burr thought there was going to be a war between the United States and Spain. And he thought this was certain. And he was allegedly sort of making moves to encourage that war, to help egg it on. And Jefferson found out about these charges, about Burr doing this, and he charges Burr with treason, and he opens up an investigation to like what was going on. And they found out that Burr wasn't just egging on this war, trying to start a war between the United States and Spain. He was trying to, he wanted the war to start, and then while the United States and Spain went to war, he was going to take his private army and conquer Mexico City and claim the country for himself. And he wanted to make himself the first emperor of Mexico, which is just insane. Like I said, Mexico is still 16 years away from gaining independence. It was still part of Spain, but he's hoping to steal it away and make himself emperor of Mexico. Obviously, this does not happen. The evidence against Burr that they had were all copies of letters, and it was deemed inadmissible. So he ended up getting acquitted of these treason charges. But he ends up fleeing the United States in disgrace, lands in England trying to raise money for this invasion of Mexico. And they don't want anything to do with them. So they kick him out. They put him on a boat. Then he goes to France and tries to ask Napoleon for the money. Napoleon wants nothing to do with this guy. It kicks him out of the country pretty much almost as soon as he gets off the boat, and sends him out. And Burr, with nowhere else to go, totally disgraced, ends up back in New York a couple of years later. He changes his name to his mother's maiden name, Edwards. I'm not sure exactly what happened to the murder charges, or if they didn't. Everybody knew who he was, essentially. But he adopts 2 boys. He doesn't marry, and he lives the rest of his life pretty much in obscurity as a kind of a small-time lawyer outside of New York. So it's a weird story. That's one of the sudden weird things that happen in American history. Okay. Moving forward, got a couple tiny points. Some more important than others in this. So Jefferson leaves office in 1808, or 1809, elections in 1808. I'm not going to say much in this next period. There's not a ton to say in the 18 teens and 20s. There will be some stuff that I talk about with regards to slavery later on. But the War of 1812, when the U.S. goes to war against Great Britain again, this happens because the British were fighting against Napoleon. Everything comes back to Napoleon at this time. In fighting against Napoleon, the British were stealing American ships and stealing American sailors. The idea of impressment, of taking American sailors, and it's like, you're fighting in our war now, and you're on the ship or we shoot you. So doing that to a bunch of Americans. Americans didn't like that very much. And they kept telling the British not to do it, and they kept doing it anyway. They're also blocking some ports in the Caribbean, which the Americans were uncomfortable with. So they went to war against the British. Shortly after they go to war against the British, Napoleon gets defeated, and then all of the British might is directed back at the United States. And, you know, American Revolution Part 2, Britain crushes the United States when they put their full attention on it, and, you know, they don't have to fight. You know, they're not trying to win the country back. They're just trying to mess up until the United States surrenders. They don't have to try to, you know, win hearts and minds or anything like that. So they just burn down Washington, D.C. and the White House and everything. So, yeah, they're able to conquer us much easier this time. And there's all kinds of interesting accounts of what, you know, what it was like seeing the Redcoats, you know, burn down the Capitol. This, of course, is when the Star-Spangled Banner gets written in the Battle of Baltimore. Andrew Jackson makes a name for himself, which is its own sort of interesting story about he gets his ragtag group of people like pirates and stuff like that to help fight and defend New Orleans. There's a really good drunk history episode. If you look at the Battle of New Orleans or Andrew Jackson on that show, Drunk History, it's actually pretty accurate. But that's all there is to say about that. It's one of those unimportant things in American history. There's a video here, but I told you everything you need to know about it. Something that is happening progressively over through the 18 teens and 20s is new states are being added all of the time. They are, you know, we obviously can't go through each new state getting added, but you can see, you know, the sort of progression of new states coming along. We'll get later on about this whole thing with the Missouri Compromise. Don't worry about that yet. The thing I want you to know now is, you know, for every new state that comes in, there has to be a counter on the other side of the Mason-Dixon line. So if a new free state wants to come in, there needs to be a new slave state. New slave state wants to come in, a new free state needs to be added. And they will do this even to the point where, like, they create Maine. You know, Maine had been part of Massachusetts. They basically created, like, just to counteract, to allow a slave state into the Union. And this is so they don't ever have an imbalance in representation. I can go on to this next slide here. You would always have, you know, the Senate is this idea, you know, where the states are represented equally. It's not based on population, it's just based on states. And if there was ever too many senators on one side and not the other, that side could pass laws or regulating slavery or forcing slavery to go in the North and things like that. So both sides would never allow that imbalance to happen. So as they're adding states, it's always 1 for 1. And as this is happening, the other kind of thing that starts to really eat away at Northerners is like, hey, it was one thing when we tolerated slavery in the South, but now we're allowing it to grow. Now, you know, by us moving west, you know, of course they want to move west and, you know, get new territory and going. Like you know, as Northerners are adding free states, they're also helping to add slave states, helping slavery grow in this institution, and that is going to bother them. They're going to say, like, wait a minute, are we now morally on the hook for these guys who are, you know, who are slavers in the South? Like I said, we tolerated before, but now we're helping them. So that's going to start eating away. And really, like I said, going forward here, we're going to be talking a lot about slavery. We'll stop a little bit. We'll check in with Native Americans in the 1830s, which we haven't seen for a little while. But most of what we're doing now is pushing towards the Civil War and to the end of class. And like I said, I love this stuff. If you can't tell, I've gotten, you know, I've already gotten more animated in this lecture probably. So, you know, I'm having more fun if I'm cursing a lot. So anyway, that's it. Don't forget, on Thursday, we are Zooming, and I will post a quiz for you guys. I'll post the next video, lecture like this, next Tuesday. All right, but I'll see you guys on Thursday.